I thought he was confused. Those were the words I repeated to myself for years after my husband died. If I had listened more carefully, I might have understood everything much sooner. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I was 72 years old when I finally realized that my husband's last warning had never been about the future. It had been about the people standing right beside me. The warning came 3 days before Charles passed away. He had been in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. We had been married for 45 years. By then, we understood each other without needing many words. That afternoon, however, Charles seemed unusually serious. He waited until we were alone before speaking. I remember sitting beside his bed holding his hand when he looked directly at me and said something I never forgot. When the time comes, do not stop asking questions. At first, I smiled. The statement felt strange, but harmless. I assumed he was speaking generally. Perhaps he meant financial matters. Perhaps he meant life in general. Before I could ask what he meant, he squeezed my hand and added another sentence. Some answers will not come to you willingly. Even now, years later, I can still hear his voice. At the time, however, I did not understand. I told myself he was tired. I told myself medication and exhaustion were affecting his thoughts. Most importantly, I told myself there would be time later to ask him what he meant. There was not. Charles passed away 3 days later. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief, paperwork, phone calls, and decisions. Like many widows, I spent those early months simply trying to make it through each day. Fortunately, my son Ryan and my daughter-in-law Ashley stepped forward to help. They handled appointments. They organized meetings. They sorted documents and communicated with attorneys and financial advisors. I was grateful. More than grateful. I trusted them completely. Ryan was my only child. Ashley had been part of our family for nearly 15 years. If someone had suggested I should be cautious around either of them, I would have dismissed the idea immediately. For years, life settled into a routine. Holidays came and went. Family dinners continued. Birthdays were celebrated. Gradually, the sharp edges of grief softened. Yet one thing never disappeared. Every so often, usually late at night, I would remember Charles's final words. Do not stop asking questions. The phrase lingered in my mind like a song I could not forget. I never understood why. Then, 7 years later, something happened. It began with a conversation so ordinary that most people would have ignored it. During a family gathering, a casual remark about old records and financial paperwork caught my attention. The comment itself was insignificant. What mattered was the reaction it produced. For a brief moment, I noticed Ashley and Ryan exchange a look. A quick glance. Barely noticeable. Yet something about it felt familiar. Uncomfortable. That night, sitting alone in my living room, I found myself thinking about Charles again. About the hospital room. About his expression. About the warning I had ignored for so long. For the first time in 7 years, I stopped wondering what he meant. Instead, I began wondering why he felt the need to say it at all. And once that question entered my mind, it refused to leave. For the next several days, I could not stop thinking about that moment. The glance between Ryan and Ashley lasted less than a second, yet it stayed with me far longer than it should have. Under normal circumstances, I would have dismissed it immediately. Families communicate with looks all the time. Yet Charles's warning had changed the way I viewed things. For the first time in years, I found myself paying attention to details I once ignored. Looking back, I realized how completely I trusted them after Charles died. During those difficult months, Ryan and Ashley handled almost everything. They attended meetings with attorneys. They organized financial records. They helped me navigate endless paperwork. Whenever questions arose, they seemed to have answers ready. At the time, their support felt like a blessing. I never imagined there was any reason to question it. One afternoon, while sorting through old files in my home office, I came across a folder containing documents from the year Charles died. Most of the contents were familiar. Insurance paperwork, tax information, property records. Then I noticed something strange. Several meeting summaries referenced attachments that were missing. The summaries themselves looked complete, but they clearly referred to supporting documents that were no longer there. At first, I assumed they had been misplaced. Yet the more I searched, the more unusual the pattern became. The missing items were concentrated within a specific period immediately after Charles's death. That evening, I called Ryan. The conversation started normally. We discussed family plans, upcoming holidays, and a few neighborhood updates. Then I casually mentioned that I had been reviewing some old paperwork. There was a brief pause on the line. Not long, just long enough for me to notice. Ryan asked what kind of paperwork I was reviewing. I explained that I was organizing old files from several years ago. He immediately reassured me that everything important had already been handled. The answer sounded reasonable, yet something about it felt familiar, almost rehearsed. The following day, Ashley called. She said Ryan mentioned I had been sorting through old records and wanted to know whether I needed help. Once again, I mentioned finding incomplete files. Once again, the response came quickly. Ashley explained that old records often become separated over time and suggested that I should not worry about missing pages from documents that old. Her explanation made sense. Yet after we ended the conversation, I found myself asking the same question I asked after speaking with Ryan. Why did both of them seem so eager to move me away from the subject? That weekend, I returned to the hospital memory that started everything. I sat alone in my living room and tried to remember every detail from my final conversation with Charles. His expression, his tone, his exact words. Do not stop asking questions. The sentence felt different now, less like advice and more like instruction, as if he knew there would come a day when I needed to keep searching even when people wanted me to stop. Later that night, while reviewing additional records, I found a note attached to one of Charles's financial summaries. It was brief, only a few lines long, yet one sentence immediately caught my attention. It referenced future disclosures and ongoing communications regarding matters that should remain transparent. Transparent. The word stood out because it echoed everything Charles had always believed. Throughout our marriage, he valued openness. He hated secrecy. As I stared at the page beneath the warm glow of a table lamp, a troubling realization settled over me. The more I learned about Charles's intentions, the less they seemed to match what actually happened after he died. And for the first time, I began to suspect that his final warning was not about a single secret. It was about a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight all along. 3 days later, the first real clue appeared. Until then, I had questions, suspicions, and fragments of information. What I did not have was evidence. That changed on a quiet Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing old correspondence stored inside a filing cabinet in my home office. The cabinet had not been opened in years. Most of the folders contained routine records, tax returns, insurance statements, property documents, the kind of paperwork people keep simply because they might need it someday. Near the back of one drawer, I found a folder labeled Annual Reviews. The title immediately caught my attention because it matched terminology I had already seen in several of Charles's notes. Curious, I opened it. Most of the contents looked ordinary at first. Then I noticed a series of review summaries dating from the years immediately following Charles's death. The documents themselves were not unusual. What shocked me was the recipient information. Every summary listed distribution contacts. My name appeared on none of them. Ryan's name appeared repeatedly. Ashley's appeared as well. I sat down and read every page carefully. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Important information continued flowing after Charles died. Reports continued being generated. Meetings continued being scheduled. Yet somehow, I remained outside the communication chain. The discovery unsettled me more than I expected. Not because I believed anything illegal had occurred. Nothing in the documents suggested that. What troubled me was something simpler. The information belonged to me as much as anyone else. Why was I excluded? That evening, I called Ryan. This time, I asked a more direct question. I mentioned the annual review summaries and asked whether he remembered them. The silence that followed felt different from previous conversations. Longer. He eventually admitted that some reports had been routed through him after Charles's death. According to Ryan, the arrangement was meant to simplify communication during a difficult period. His explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet when I asked why the arrangement continued for years afterward, he struggled to answer. Instead, he suggested that many of the reports were technical and unlikely to interest me. After we ended the call, I wrote down every detail I could remember. The exact wording, the pauses, the explanations. Then I compared those notes to the documents spread across my dining room table. For the first time, a timeline began forming. One event connected to another. One explanation connected to a decision. One decision connected to a pattern. Later that night, I found myself thinking about Charles again. Specifically, I thought about the look in his eyes when he delivered his final warning. At the time, I believed he was worried about the future in a general sense. Now I wondered whether he had something far more specific in mind. The following morning, I returned to the annual review folder. Buried near the bottom was a reference to a follow-up meeting that occurred approximately 18 months after Charles died. Attached to the summary was a note indicating that future disclosures would continue through existing channels. Existing channels. The phrase immediately stood out. It suggested the communication structure was not temporary. It was becoming permanent. I read the page 3 times before setting it down. Outside, sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows. Inside, the room felt unusually quiet. Every new document seemed to push me closer to the same conclusion. Charles had not warned me about a single event. He had warned me about a process. A process that slowly removed me from conversations I should have been part of. And for the first time since this journey began, I started to believe his warning had been far more accurate than I ever imagined. The next piece of the puzzle arrived through a name I had never paid attention to before. While reviewing the annual review summaries for what felt like the 100th time, I noticed repeated references to a man named Edward Parker. His name appeared on correspondence, disclosure records, and meeting notes stretching across several years. Until then, I assumed he was simply another advisor among many. Yet the frequency of his involvement suggested otherwise. Curious, I searched through old records and eventually discovered that Edward had been both a longtime attorney and close friend of Charles. To my surprise, he was still practicing part-time and living only a short drive away. I called his office the next morning. After a brief conversation, he agreed to meet with me. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from him in a quiet conference room lined with bookshelves and framed legal certificates. Edward listened carefully as I explained why I was there. Then I placed copies of the annual review summaries and disclosure records on the table. He examined them one by one. The longer he read, the more thoughtful he became. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Margaret," he said softly, "you were always supposed to receive this information directly." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the chest. For weeks, I had been piecing together clues. Now, for the first time, someone directly connected to Charles was confirming what I feared. Edward explained that Charles valued transparency above almost everything else. Whenever financial matters were discussed, he insisted that both of us remain informed. According to Edward, detailed disclosure procedures were established specifically to prevent misunderstandings after Charles's death. As he spoke, I felt the timeline in. My mind shifting once again. The problem was no longer whether information existed. The problem was understanding how it stopped reaching me. Before I left, Edward provided copies of archived correspondence from his own files. Most of the material duplicated records I already possessed. Then I found something different. One memorandum summarized discussions regarding future communication procedures after Charles's death. Several sections immediately caught my attention. According to the notes, concerns had been raised about simplifying future disclosures by routing information through family representatives. The representatives listed were Ryan and Ashley. I read the page several times. Then I read it again. The language sounded professional, harmless, even. Yet after everything I had learned, its significance felt impossible to ignore. Driving home, I found myself replaying every conversation I had with Ryan and Ashley during the years after Charles died. Every reassurance, every explanation, every suggestion that complicated financial matters had already been handled. The memories felt different now, not because the words changed, but because the context had. Later that evening, I spread Edward's documents across my dining room table beside everything else. The timeline continued growing. Meetings connected to correspondence. Correspondence connected to disclosures. Disclosures connected to decisions. Slowly, a complete picture began forming. One detail in particular stood out. The communication structure changed shortly after Charles died and remained largely unchanged for years afterward. That realization bothered me deeply. Temporary arrangements make sense during difficult times. 7 years of the same arrangement felt very different. As darkness settled outside my windows, I stared at the records covering my table. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Charles's warning no longer felt mysterious. It felt specific, deliberate, as if he anticipated that one day I would need to uncover a story hidden beneath years of routine explanations. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the people closest to me knew far more about that story then. they ever admitted. After meeting with Edward Parker, I stopped searching for isolated answers and started searching for patterns. The distinction mattered. Individual documents could be explained away. One missing report might be an oversight. One delayed communication might be a mistake. A pattern was different. Patterns reveal intent. For the next several days, I focused entirely on building a timeline. Every annual disclosure, every meeting summary, every communication memorandum, every letter Charles left behind. By the time I finished, my dining room table had disappeared beneath stacks of paperwork. Colored notes marked key dates. Legal pads contained observations and questions. Looking at everything together created an unsettling feeling. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same decisions surfaced again and again. Most importantly, the same communication structure remained in place year after year. One rainy afternoon, Edward called unexpectedly. He explained that while reviewing additional archived files, he discovered correspondence that had never been included in the digital records. To him, the material seemed minor. To me, it felt like another missing piece. When the copies arrived, I opened them immediately. Most consisted of routine administrative notes. Then I found a memorandum discussing beneficiary communications approximately 1 year after Charles died. The language appeared professional and ordinary. Yet one sentence immediately captured my attention. It stated that future disclosures should remain streamlined through existing family channels to avoid unnecessary complications. I stared at the sentence for several moments. The wording sounded familiar because similar phrases appeared throughout the records. Streamlined, simplified, consolidated. Each term seemed harmless on its own. Together, they described a system designed to control information flow. That evening, I spread the new documents across my table beside the existing timeline. The picture became clearer than ever. Reports continued being generated. Updates continued being issued. Meetings continued being held. The information never disappeared. It simply traveled through channels that no longer included me. The realization hurt more than I expected. For years, I believed I was fully informed. In reality, I had been receiving only fragments of a much larger story. The following weekend, I attended a family gathering at Ryan and Ashley's house. Normally, these events felt comfortable, familiar, predictable. This time, I found myself observing rather than participating. Every conversation seemed different now. Every comment carried additional meaning. At one point, someone mentioned estate planning and financial transparency. The discussion lasted less than a minute before Ashley redirected it toward another topic. Most people probably would not have noticed. I did. Later, while helping clear dishes from the table, I overheard a brief exchange in the kitchen. Ashley quietly asked Ryan whether certain records had ever been located. Ryan responded with a quick glance toward the dining room where I was standing. The conversation stopped immediately after that. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it remained in my thoughts the entire drive home. Back at my house, I sat alone reviewing the timeline once more. The evidence no longer pointed toward confusion. It pointed toward decisions. Deliberate decisions made repeatedly over many years. Some may have begun with good intentions. Others may have been motivated by convenience. Regardless of the reason, the result remained the same. Information intended for me never reached me. Shortly before midnight, I added another page to the binder I had begun assembling. Every document strengthened the same conclusion. Charles's warning was not about a specific event. It was about a process that slowly unfolded after he was gone. And for the first time since this investigation began, I felt certain that the answers I needed were no longer hidden in documents. They were hidden in the explanations people would eventually have to give. The breakthrough came from a mistake. Not my mistake. Someone else's. By early December, the binder on my dining room table had grown thick enough to hold years of correspondence, disclosure reports, financial records, meeting summaries, and notes from both Edward Parker and my own investigation. The timeline was nearly complete. Every major event had been documented. Every important decision had been connected to supporting records. Yet one question still remained. Why did the communication structure continue for so many years after Charles died? One afternoon, while reviewing archive correspondence for what felt like the 100th time, I noticed a reference number written in the margin of an administrative summary. The number pointed toward a supporting document that was not attached. Missing attachments had become a familiar theme by then, but this one felt different. The notation was unusually specific. Curious, I contacted Edward and asked whether he could locate the referenced file. 2 days later, he called back. He sounded surprised. According to Edward, the missing document had been stored separately inside an archive box that nobody had reviewed in years. When the copy arrived, I opened it immediately. At first glance, it appeared routine. The document summarized discussions among advisors approximately 14 months after Charles's death. Then I reached a paragraph that made me stop reading. The summary discussed whether future disclosures should be expanded, reduced, or maintained. According to the notes, concerns had been raised that providing full reports directly might create confusion and unnecessary questions. I read the sentence several times. Then I continued. What came next was even more revealing. The document explained that the existing communication arrangement was working effectively because designated family contacts were already handling information management. Information management. The phrase sounded clinical and harmless. Yet in the context of everything else I had discovered, its meaning felt unmistakable. The goal was no longer communication. The goal was control. That evening, I sat alone at my dining room table studying the document beneath the warm glow of a table lamp. Outside, winter rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, every piece of the puzzle finally seemed to fit together. The arrangement did not continue because people forgot to change it. It continued because changing it would require giving up control over information. Several days later, another discovery reinforced that conclusion. While organizing records chronologically, I found an email summary attached to one of the annual disclosures. The summary referenced concerns about maintaining consistency in communications. More importantly, it noted that questions should continue being addressed through existing representatives. Once again, the same names appeared. Ryan, Ashley. The pattern was now impossible to dismiss. The following weekend, Ryan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded unusually careful. He asked how I was doing and whether I had finally finished sorting through all those old documents. The question immediately caught my attention. For months, neither he nor Ashley seemed interested in the details of my research. Now he was asking directly. I answered honestly. I told him I had learned a great deal. Silence followed. Then he suggested that old records can sometimes be misleading when viewed outside their original context. The phrase felt familiar because I had heard variations of it before. After ending the call, I wrote his exact words into my notebook. Then I compared them with explanations already appearing throughout the records. The similarities were striking. As midnight approached, I looked across the binder spread open before me. The investigation that began with Charles's final warning was nearly finished. The evidence no longer pointed toward uncertainty. It pointed toward a complete story. And for the first time since Charles spoke those final words in a hospital room 7 years earlier, I believed I finally understood why he wanted me to keep asking questions. By the middle of December, the investigation was effectively complete. The binder sitting on my dining room table contained years of disclosure records, correspondence summaries, administrative memoranda, annual reviews, and notes from conversations with Edward Parker. Every major question had an answer. Every answer connected to a document. Most importantly, every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Charles's warning had not been vague. He understood that one day I might need to look beyond the explanations I was given. For several evenings, I sat alone reviewing the timeline from beginning to end. The process felt almost surreal. 7 years of events unfolded across the pages before me. Meetings, reports, communications, decisions. Looking at everything together revealed something that individual documents could not. The communication structure never drifted accidentally. It remained in place because people continued choosing it. One Thursday afternoon, while reviewing the binder one final time, I discovered a small inconsistency that became the last piece of the puzzle. The issue involved annual disclosure reports generated during the second year after Charles's death. According to one set of records, the reports were distributed successfully. According to another, questions regarding the reports were redirected through family representatives. The contradiction itself was subtle, yet when compared against every other document, it revealed something important. Information was not simply passing through Ryan and Ashley. Information was being filtered before it reached me. That evening, I called Edward and walked him through the discrepancy. After reviewing the records, he agreed with my interpretation. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Margaret, I think you have enough now. The documents tell the story on their own. He was right. For weeks, I believed I still needed one final discovery. Another letter. Another report. Another hidden file. The truth was already complete. What remained was sharing it. The following day, I called Ryan and asked whether we could all sit down together before Christmas. He immediately sounded cautious. Before I finished explaining, he asked whether Edward would be involved. The question itself felt revealing. I answered honestly. Edward had agreed to attend if needed. Several seconds passed before Ryan responded. Finally, he agreed. Later that evening, Ashley called. Her tone was warm, but there was tension beneath it. She asked whether the meeting was truly necessary and suggested that old records often create misunderstandings. The comment sounded familiar because I had encountered similar explanations throughout the investigation. Simplify, streamline, avoid confusion. The language never changed. After ending the call, I added one final note to my binder. Not because it proved anything new, because it reflected the same pattern appearing in every document I had reviewed. The next several days were spent organizing evidence. Every disclosure report was placed in chronological order. Every memorandum was labeled. Every correspondence summary was cross-referenced against the timeline. By Christmas week, the binder looked less like a collection of records and more like a complete history. Looking at it, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Confidence. Not because I wanted conflict. Not because I wanted anyone embarrassed. Because uncertainty was finally gone. Charles's warning no longer felt mysterious. I understood it now. He was not telling me what to think. He was reminding me to keep asking questions until I found the truth. As I closed the binder and turned off the dining room light that evening, I realized the investigation was over. The next chapter would not be about discovery. It would be about accountability. And for the first time since Charles spoke those final words, I felt ready to hear every answer that followed. The meeting took place 2 days before Christmas. Snow flurries drifted through the cold afternoon air as I pulled into Ryan and Ashley's driveway. The binder sat on the passenger seat beside me. For weeks, it had grown thicker with every discovery. What began with Charles's final warning had become a complete record of everything that followed his death. As I carried the binder toward the house, I felt surprisingly calm. The questions that once kept me awake at night had been answered. Whatever happened during the meeting, the facts would remain unchanged. Inside, the atmosphere felt tense from the moment I arrived. Ryan greeted me politely, but there was nervousness behind his smile. Ashley appeared calm on the surface, though I noticed how tightly she held her coffee cup. Edward Parker arrived shortly afterward carrying several folders of his own. A few close relatives joined us as well. Nobody seemed interested in small talk. Everyone understood this gathering was different. Eventually, we settled around the dining room table. The room fell silent. Outside, snow continued falling softly beyond the windows. Inside, every eye turned toward the binder resting in front of me. Ryan spoke first. He said he hoped everyone could approach the conversation calmly and avoid assumptions. The statement sounded reasonable, yet it also felt familiar. For years, explanations had been used to guide conversations away from uncomfortable questions. This time, the questions were staying. I opened the binder and began at the beginning. Charles's final warning, the annual review summaries, the disclosure reports, the communication memoranda, the correspondence recovered through Edward Parker. One document at a time, I walked everyone through the timeline. At first, Ashley responded confidently. She explained that after Charles died, many administrative responsibilities became overwhelming. She insisted that routing information through family representatives seemed practical and efficient. Ryan agreed. Several times, he emphasized that nobody intended to hurt anyone. Listening to them, I understood why those explanations survived for so many years. Viewed individually, each decision seemed reasonable. The problem was that the documents no longer existed individually. Together, they revealed a pattern. As the evidence accumulated across the table, the atmosphere began changing. Edward explained Charles's expectations regarding transparency. He reviewed written instructions emphasizing open communication and direct disclosures. Then I presented the memoranda discussing information routing. Next came the annual reports intended for me, but distributed elsewhere. One by one, the records connected. Ryan attempted to challenge several conclusions. He argued that administrative confusion often occurs after a death. He suggested that everyone was doing the best they could during a difficult period. For a while, some relatives seemed willing to consider those explanations. Then I presented the document discussing information management and communication control. The room grew noticeably quieter. After that came the records showing how the same structure remained in place year after year. Temporary decisions had become permanent practices. Finally, Edward placed Charles's written instructions in the center of the table. The language was clear, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Charles wanted transparency. He wanted communication. He wanted me informed. Across the table, I watched Ryan read the document several times. Then he compared it with the disclosure records. Then with the communication summaries. Around the room, relatives exchanged uneasy looks. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The evidence had become too complete. For the first time since Charles spoke those final words in a hospital room 7 years earlier, everyone sitting around that table was looking at the same truth. And as I watched the realization settle across their faces, I understood that explanations were no longer enough. The time for answers had finally arrived. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Around the table, relatives continued reading the documents spread before them. Annual disclosures, communication summaries, administrative memoranda, Charles's handwritten notes. Every page supported the next. Together, they told a story that nobody could dismiss. Across from me, Ryan remained focused on the records. Several times, he reread the same documents. Then he compared them against others. The room remained quiet except for the occasional sound of paper being turned. Ashley sat beside him with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The confidence she displayed earlier had disappeared. For the first time that afternoon, neither of them seemed interested in defending the communication structure that had remained in place for so many years. Eventually, one of the relatives asked the question everyone was thinking. If Charles wanted Margaret informed about everything, why was she left outside the process for 7 years? Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched across the room. Finally, Ryan placed the documents on the table and took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice sounded tired. He admitted that after Charles died, he and Ashley believed they were helping by handling information themselves. At first, the arrangement felt temporary. Reports arrived. Meetings occurred. Decisions needed attention. Managing everything seemed easier than explaining every detail. Then months became years. The system continued because nobody challenged it. Listening to him, I felt sadness more than anger. The explanation was not dramatic. There had been no hidden conspiracy, no elaborate scheme, just years of small decisions that slowly removed me from conversations I should have been part of. Ashley eventually spoke as well. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. She admitted that many of the reports seemed technical and complicated. She believed she was protecting me from unnecessary stress. Yet as she spoke, the central issue became clear. The problem was never complexity. The problem was choice. Nobody asked whether I wanted the information. Nobody asked whether I preferred truth over convenience. Edward Parker quietly reminded everyone that Charles's instructions consistently emphasized transparency. The same principle appeared in letters, correspondence, disclosures, and meeting records. Looking around the room, I could see relatives beginning to understand what happened. This was never about money alone. It was about trust. It was about respect. It was about deciding what another person deserved to know. As the afternoon slowly turned into evening, the atmosphere changed. The tension remained, but it no longer felt defensive. Instead, it felt reflective. Several relatives admitted they always assumed I received the same information they did. Others acknowledged they never questioned the communication structure because it appeared normal. By then, nobody was debating facts. The documents had already answered every important question. Before people began leaving, Ryan stood and walked toward the window. Snow continued falling outside. After several moments, he turned back toward me. His apology was simple and direct. No excuses. No attempts to justify the past. Just an acknowledgement that he should have trusted me enough to let me decide what information mattered. Hearing those words did not erase 7 years. It did not change the decisions that had already been made. But it mattered, more than I expected. Later that evening, I drove home beneath a dark winter sky. The binder rested beside me on the passenger seat. When I arrived home, I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. Then I thought about Charles in that hospital room 7 years earlier. For so long, I believed his final warning was a mystery waiting to be solved. Now I understood something different. He was not giving me answers. He was giving me permission to keep searching until I found them myself. And as I turned off the lights and looked out at the snow falling beyond the window, I realized he had been right all along. Some answers do not come willingly, but the truth has a way of finding the people who refuse to stop asking questions.